Have you ever seen someone whose silence was louder than screams? Someone whose eyes told a story the world refused to hear? This is the story of Elias, the boy who never spoke until his voice shook an entire town. It began one cold morning in Louisiana, 1857. The air was heavy with smoke and shame. Men in long coats gathered around a wooden platform where slaves were auctioned like cattle. Children cried, women shivered. Chains clinked like dark music of despair. And there, standing barefoot, his head bowed, was Elias, a thin, dark-skinned boy, no older than 14, his eyes deep as night. The auctioneer shouted, "Mute boy, strong arms." 9 cents, laughter filled the air. Who would want a boy who couldn't speak? Mrs. Whitmore, a widow with more money than mercy, lifted her hand. "I'll take him," she said coldly. Her tone wasn't kindness, it was curiosity. She didn't need another servant. She wanted to own silence itself. As the chains were locked around his wrists, Elias didn't fight. He looked at the sky, the only thing no one could own. Martha, the old cook, whispered, "May the Lord watch over that child." Days turned into weeks on the Whitmore plantation. Elias worked without sound. He cleaned, carried, obeyed. The other slaves whispered stories about him, that he could see spirits, that he once cried so hard a thunderstorm followed. But no one really knew. One night, while everyone slept, Mrs. Whitmore walked past the servants' quarters. The wind carried something strange, a sound, faint, beautiful, like a dream breaking through the dark. She froze. The sound came again, a voice pure as gold. It was Elias. Hidden behind the barn, he sang to the moon. His voice, powerful, deep, filled with pain and light, was like no human sound she had ever heard. The mute boy could sing. Mrs. Whitmore's heart raced. He can sing," she whispered. For a moment, even she forgot she was his owner. In that moment, she saw not a slave, but a miracle. The next morning, she summoned him. "Elias," she said, "sing." He looked down, shaking his head. She shouted, "Sing, boy," but he stood silent. Her anger rose. "Do you think your silence is power?" she screamed. He didn't answer, only tears rolled down his cheeks. Martha, watching from the doorway, whispered a prayer. She saw something dangerous in Mrs. Whitmore's eyes, obsession. Because when a cruel person finds beauty in what they control, it's never love, it's hunger. That night, Mrs. Whitmore couldn't sleep. She wanted the world to hear that voice. She imagined guests, praise, attention, a mute boy turned opera prodigy, all under her name. But she didn't see Elias as a child. She saw him as her property, her ticket to glory. The next evening, she came again to the barn. "Elias," she said softly this time, "sing for me." He hesitated, then sang. The sound was haunting. The melody was sorrow itself. It rose, broke, and fell like waves on a grave. Mrs. Whitmore wept not for him, but for herself. She saw her own loneliness reflected in his song. When it ended, she whispered, "You belong to me." But Elias looked her in the eyes for the first time. And though his lips said nothing, his gaze said no. The next morning, rumors began to spread. The overseer, Mr. Jenkins, said he heard a ghost in the barn. Martha told the others, "It's the boy." The Lord gave him a voice to break chains. And in the quiet corners of the plantation, slaves began to hope again. Because if a boy who could not speak could sing, maybe freedom could, too. But Mrs. Whitmore was changing. The sound of Elias' song haunted her mind. She wanted him to sing for her guests, but he refused. Each night she'd say, "Do it for me, Elias." Each night he'd bow in silence, until one evening her patience died. "You will sing," she whispered with venom. "You will sing for me or I'll have you whipped." Martha tried to stop her. "Ma'am, please, he's just a child." Mrs. Whitmore slapped her. "Silence, woman." Elias didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply looked up, his eyes no longer afraid. And then, without warning, he began to sing. But this time, it wasn't gentle. It was thunder. His song carried across the fields, over the river, into the town. It was pain and fury and history wrapped in sound. Every window trembled. Every bird stopped singing. And when he stopped, everything fell silent again. Mrs. Whitmore dropped to her knees, trembling. "What are you?" she whispered. Elias looked down, tears streaming, his silence returning like a storm ending. He walked away, leaving her haunted by the echo of his voice, the mute boy who sang once and would never sing again. If this story touched your heart, don't leave without subscribing. Because stories like Elia's aren't just history, they're warnings whispered through time. Have you ever heard a sound so beautiful it drove someone mad? The night Elia's sang, the world didn't forget, but Mrs. Whitmore couldn't move on. She couldn't sleep, she couldn't eat. The melody haunted her like a ghost that refused to rest. Everywhere she walked, she imagined hearing it again, faint echoes in the hallways, the wind carrying that impossible voice. Her servants whispered, "The mistress has lost her mind." And maybe she had, because every night she would walk barefoot to the barn and whisper into the dark, "Elias, sing for me." But there was no answer, only silence. Elias no longer sang. He worked as before, eyes quiet, lips sealed. But something had changed. The way he looked at the world, stronger, colder, it frightened even the cruel overseer, Mr. Jenkins. When Jenkins tried to mock him one morning, Elias simply stared at him, not with anger, but with something sharper. And that night, a tree near the overseer's cabin was struck by lightning. After that, Jenkins never mocked him again. Mrs. Whitmore began to believe Elias was cursed. "His song brings storms," she told Martha. "He's not a boy, he's a spell." Martha shook her head. "No, ma'am, the curse ain't in the boy. It's in what folks done to him." But Mrs. Whitmore didn't listen. Her obsession turned into fear, and fear turned into cruelty. She locked Elias in the barn every night, thinking silence could break him again. But the quieter it became, the louder she heard his song inside her mind. One night, thunder rolled again. She woke up, shaking. The house was trembling, though the sky was clear, and from the barn, that voice rose once more. This time it wasn't sorrow, it was rage. His song twisted through the walls like wind through fire. Mrs. Whitmore ran outside, barefoot, her nightgown soaked in fear. She burst the barn doors open and saw Elias standing there, eyes glowing with tears, singing to nothing but darkness. But behind him, the shadows seemed to move, like unseen faces were listening. The voices of the enslaved, the forgotten, the dead. She screamed, "Stop, stop," but he kept singing. Then suddenly, silence. He looked at her calm, almost kind, and walked past her into the rain that wasn't there. Mrs. Whitmore fell to her knees, whispering, "God forgive me," because for the first time she felt like she was the one enslaved, chained by the echoes of what she had done. The next morning, Elias was gone. The barn was empty, the chains lay open, but from the nearby river, faintly, the town heard a song that sounded like forgiveness and judgment. If Elias' silence spoke louder than words, let his story live on. Subscribe now, because some voices deserve to never be forgotten. Have you ever heard a story so powerful it refused to die? Weeks had passed since Elias vanished. The plantation stood silent, but the silence was heavier than thunder. Workers whispered that the boy's voice still floated through the fields at night, calling the names of the dead. And when the wind blew, it carried a strange sound, like someone humming deep beneath the earth. Mrs. Whitmore locked herself inside her mansion. Her once perfect hair had turned grey. She burned her piano, she tore down mirrors, she even stopped eating, but nothing silenced the echoes in her head. At midnight she heard that song again, faint, distant, beautiful. She called for Martha. "Do you hear it? Tell me you hear it." Martha hesitated. "Yes, ma'am, but that ain't no curse. That's a memory that won't stay buried." The next day, Mr. Jenkins came riding from the town. His face was pale, his hands shaking. "They're talking about him," he said, "the people in Charleston. They say a boy who couldn't speak now sings in churches, sings songs that make folks cry blood." Mrs. Whitmore froze. "You think it's him?" Jenkins nodded. "It's his voice, ma'am. Ain't nobody forget a voice like that." That night she dreamed of Elias standing before her bed, not angry, not vengeful, just watching. His mouth didn't move, but she heard his song inside her head. It was a hymn, a song of freedom. And when she woke, her pillow was wet with tears. Days later, the townsfolk came to her gate. They said the mansion was cursed, that Elias' ghost was punishing the white folk of the valley. They blamed her. They wanted her gone. She tried to plead. "I gave him a home," but Martha whispered, "You bought his silence, ma'am, and now he's found his voice." That night, lightning struck the mansion again. Flames rose like wings. Inside the fire, she saw him, Elias, calm, shining, untouchable. He sang not to her, but to the sky, as if he was freeing all the souls trapped beneath the weight of injustice. Mrs. Whitmore screamed his name, but her voice was swallowed by his song, and when the flames died, she was gone. Only ashes remained, and a single golden locket that played a faint note when opened. A note from the song that once broke chains. If a voice can outlive its pain, maybe we can too. Subscribe to keep the story of Elias alive, the boy who turned silence into freedom. Have you ever wondered how a single voice could outlive an entire generation? 20 years passed since the fire at the Whitmore plantation. The land had healed, grass growing where ashes once fell, but people still spoke of the song that haunted the night air. One summer evening, a traveler named Thomas Reed arrived from New York. He was a journalist chasing ghost stories, but what he found was something far deeper. At a small church near the river, he heard an old woman humming. Her name was Martha, her eyes dim, but her memory sharp as glass. "You've come to ask about the boy," she said softly. Reed nodded. "The one who could sing," she smiled sadly. "He wasn't just a singer, sir. He was a promise God didn't forget." She told him everything, how Elias had been born mute, sold for 9 cents, treated like property. How Mrs. Whitmore first pitied him, then grew addicted to his gift, and finally destroyed herself chasing what she could never own. "How did he learn to sing?" Reed asked. Martha's eyes filled with tears. "He didn't learn, he remembered. That voice wasn't from this world. It was every soul that ever suffered, singing through him." Reed followed the trail down to the river. There, hidden in the tall reeds, stood an old wooden cross. Someone had carved one word into it, Elias. And as Reed bowed his head, the wind rose gently, carrying a sound that stopped his heart. It was a voice, pure, distant, echoing through time, not a ghost's cry, but a hymn of peace. He stood there, trembling, realizing that Elias' song was still being sung by the children of those who once bowed in chains, now standing free in their own church, singing the same tune. The reporter returned to New York and wrote about the boy. He called it "The Voice That Freed the Dead." And across the country, people read it. For the first time, they didn't see Elias as a slave, but as a symbol. A boy who turned pain into art, silence into power, and tragedy into a timeless song. Years later, people still say that if you walk by that river on a quiet night, you can hear it faint, like a prayer carried on the wind. The song of a boy who refused to stay silent, a boy who proved that even the forgotten can never truly disappear. If Elias' song touched your heart, let it live through you. Subscribe so his voice never fades into silence again. Because some stories aren't just history, they're reminders of who we still need to become.